My name is Kendra Salyer. I'm 39 years old. And the spring I was 19, my mother told the fire department committee that the $4,260 this town had raised for a family whose house burned down went missing out of her kitchen, and then she wouldn't say one more word about how, and she let this county spend the next 20 years deciding it was me. 5 people on that committee watched her cry. She never said my name. She never had to. For 20 years, my mother had exactly one kindness for me. She gave it at Christmas, and in the vestibule after funerals, and once in a hospital hallway with her palm flat on my arm. She'd lean in and say it low, the way you pass somebody something folded. I never once said your name. She meant it as mercy. She said it the way you hand a person a coat in a cold parking lot. It took me 20 years and a milk crate to work out that it wasn't a coat. It was a lid, and she'd been holding it down my whole adult life. So on the second Saturday of April, I stood at the end of a folding table in the community room at the Dunbarton Fire Hall, holding a knee-high black rubber boot, and my mother had just finished blowing out 75 candles. There were about 40 people in that room. What none of them knew, standing there with their paper plates, was that I hadn't gone looking for anything. It came up out of a crawl space 3 weeks before, in the arms of a 20-year-old boy who was getting paid $18 an hour to empty a house, and he held it over his head and asked whose it was. My mother answered before anybody else's mouth was open. She answered fast. She's 75 years old, and I hadn't watched her move like that since my father was alive. I'm going to tell you what was in that boot and what wasn't. But first you need to know what my name was worth in Dunbarton, Ohio, and what it cost, and who paid it. Welcome back to Porch Stories, where a woman a whole county quietly agreed about finally sets the thing down on the table and asks to be called by her own name. If you've ever walked into a room and felt it go careful, and nobody ever told you why, this one's for you. Tell me in the comments how long your family's been sure about you. Then subscribe, because the part I still can't get all the way through is what my father was doing at the door every single time I left. Let me back you up 20 years and change, to before any of it, so you know what there was to lose. I wash dogs for a living. I've done it for 16 years at Ackerman's, which is a 2-chair grooming shop behind the old feed store on Water Street. And the woman whose name is on the window is Wilma Ackerman, who's 72 and keeps a coffee can of ballpoint pens that don't write. Not one of them writes. I've tested them. She won't throw a single one out because somebody might come in needing to sign something, and in her mind that day is still coming. I get there at 7. The first thing I do is turn the water on to let the line warm up, because the well out back runs cold enough in February to make an old dog holler, and I won't do that to an old dog. Then I check the book. Then I let Dozer out. Dozer is Wilma's wire terrier, and he's 14 and mostly blind, and he owns the second chair. He doesn't get groomed in it. He sits in it. If you set a dog in that chair, he'll stand underneath it and complain until you fix your mistake. Wilma says he's been the manager since before I was hired, and I've never once heard her call that a joke. The dogs are the reason I stayed. Pearl is a Cocker Spaniel, 14, with a bad left hip, and you have to lift her with one arm under the chest and one under the rear, or she'll scream and then be ashamed of herself. Bishop is a Great Pyrenees the size of a chest freezer who lies down the second you touch him and sighs like you've asked him for money. Pickle is a Shih Tzu who hates me personally and has hated me since 2014. And I do her face last, and I talk to her the entire time about nothing, and she has never forgiven me for anything. That's my day. Warm water, old hips, wet hair on my forearms until 9 at night some Fridays. It's not a career. In this county, it's barely a job, and it is the only room in Dunbarton where nobody ever watched their purse when I came in. I'm married to Lonnie Salyer, who drives a propane truck for the co-op and leaves his boots on the step because of the smell, winter included, and comes in his sock feet like a burglar. We've been married 17 years. Lonnie's a quiet man in the way some men are quiet because they've got nothing to say, and other men are quiet because they've already decided and don't see the point in arguing about it. Lonnie's the second kind. I'll tell you the thing about him that took me 11 years to notice. He hands me his wallet. If we're at the counter and his hands are full, he holds the wallet out sideways without looking, the way you'd hand somebody a pen. He's done it 1,000 times. He has no idea he does it. And every single time, some small animal in the back of my chest sits up, because he's the only adult in my life who's ever handed me money without a beat of hesitation in it first. Our boy is Tanner. He's 14, and he's built like a coat rack, and he cannot walk past the shop window without knocking on it twice. Even now, even with his friends watching. 2 knocks. Then he keeps walking like he didn't. He does it when he's mad at me too, which is how I know it isn't affection so much as it's structural. And I had a father, Delbert Renfro, who worked 31 years at the elevator in Ashkirk and died 9 years ago, in March, of a stroke, in his own driveway, with the truck running. I'm going to come back to my father. I have to build up to him. Now let me show you my mother the way this county sees her, because if I don't, none of the rest of it will make sense to you. Yvonne Renfro is the woman you call when somebody dies. That's not a figure of speech. There's a phone tree in Dunbarton that's older than I am, and my mother has been at the top of it since before I could read. Somebody's husband goes in the ground, and inside of 4 hours there are 2 roasters and a sheet cake and a folding table on that family's porch. And my mother's the one who set the whole thing moving with a legal pad and a kitchen phone. She ran the funeral dinners at the Methodist church for 30 years. She ran the auxiliary at the fire department for 22. When the petted boy got hurt on the combine, she had a jar on the counter at the grocery the next morning. When old Mrs. Croyle lost her house to the county for taxes, my mother drove her to Zanesville twice a week for a year and never mentioned it once. And I only know because Mrs. Croyle told me at the shop with tears in her eyes while I clipped her dog. That's not a mask. It would be a great deal easier on me if it were, and it isn't. She really does all of it. She's really the first one there. I've watched her hold a stranger's hand in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m. like it was the only hand in the building. And she had a sentence for it. She'd say it in the car on the way home, tired, with her shoes off. Somebody's got to be the one who shows up. She said it the way other women say, amen. My mother was born Yvonne Souter, and if you want to understand her, you have to understand what that name meant at a counter in this town in 1958. Her father was Orville Souter. He owed money at the hardware, at the feed store, at the car lot, and at the funeral home, which is a special kind of talent. There was a card in a box under the register at the hardware store with his name on it and a note about cash only, and my mother saw that card when she was 9 years old because the man behind the counter pulled it out and read it to her while she stood there with her mother's list in her hand. In 39 years I have heard her tell that twice, and she was standing up both times, and she doesn't cry when she tells it. She gets very still and very pleasant, which in my mother is the same thing. So, she spent 50 years buying a name. Not metaphorically, she bought it. She bought it with hams and hot dishes and gas money and graduation checks and flowers for hospital rooms and coats for kids who weren't hers. And the town gave her the receipt she wanted, which was that people in Dunbarton say her name a certain way, with a little lift on it, the way you say the name of a landmark. Understand that, and you'll understand the whole thing. She wasn't guarding a reputation the way a proud woman guards one. She was making the payment on a debt her father left her every week for 50 years, and she'd have sold anything at all before she'd miss one, including me. A card under a register in 1958 will carry you all the way up to that kitchen table on a Thursday night. It doesn't carry you across it, but I'm ahead of myself. 20 years ago this March, the Dutcher place burned on Croyle Road. It was a chimney fire in a house that shouldn't have had a fire in that chimney, and it went up the wall inside the plaster where nobody could see it, and by the time the trucks got out there, the roof was gone. Nobody died. That mattered enormously at the time, and it's the only reason this is a story about money. There were 4 Dutcher kids. The youngest was 7, and her name is Jenna, and she'll be back in this later. And she stood in the yard that night in a coat that wasn't hers because somebody had handed her one. I was 19. I'd graduated the year before. I was working part-time at the veterinary clinic in Ashkirk, answering the phone and holding cats, and I'd been accepted into the 2-year vet tech program at the branch campus, starting that fall, and I had $2,900 sitting at the credit union, put in $20 and $40 at a time since I was 15. I'd already bought the smock, that's how sure I was. The program sent a supply list in February, and the uniform place in Zanesville stitched your name on the chest for $6 extra, and I paid the $6. Teal, with a snap collar, and Kendra in white thread over the pocket. $6 extra for the name. I hung it on the back of my bedroom door where I'd see it, and every night that spring I saw it. The fire was the first week of March. My mother had a drive going by Tuesday. You've seen how these work if you're from a town like mine. A jar at the grocery, the boot at the light on Saturday morning, a pancake breakfast at the fire hall, $3 a plate, kids under 6 free, envelopes in the pews at both churches. It ran 11 days and it brought in $4,260, which in this county in 2006 was a serious amount of money, and my mother chaired it, and the money came home with her every night because that's how it had always been done, and all of it went in the boot, because in Dunbarton the boot is not a figure of speech. It's an actual turnout boot out of the gear room, knee-high black rubber with the reflective stripe worn off the toe, and it has the department's old number painted up the shaft by hand. Orville Spielman's father painted that number. Every soul in this county has stood at that light on a Saturday and dropped a folded dollar down into it. And every kid in this county has been lifted up to do it. And it doesn't just collect. That's the part you have to have. At the end of a drive, the boot goes up on the front table at the fire hall, and the family stands there and it gets tipped out in front of everybody. And that is how money gets handed over in this town, and it has been for 50 years. It's a little bit of a show. People clap. So the boot was going to the fire hall Friday, with my mother carrying it. On Thursday night, we counted it at the kitchen table. I want to give you that room exactly, because I've been in it every night for 20 years, whether I wanted to be or not. The overhead light with the one bulb out. My mother's legal pad. A church key opener she used for nothing. Coffee. 2 rubber bands. 1s and 5s in stacks. Quarters in paper rolls. Checks in their own pile with a paperclip. She read the amounts and I wrote them, and then we traded and did it the other way to check, and it came to $4,260, and she wrote it at the bottom of the pad and drew 2 lines under it. She banded it, and she put every bit of it back down in the boot for the morning, and she stood the boot by the door, and she said we'd take it over at 10. Then she asked me to run to the grocery for coffee filters, and I went, and I was gone 11 minutes, and I have thought about those 11 minutes more than I have thought about my own wedding. Friday morning, the boot was empty. She called me into the kitchen, and the boot was lying over on its side on the table with its mouth toward me, and there was nothing down in it but the rubber bands. And my mother sat down in her chair very carefully, the way you sit down when your legs have quit, and she set both palms down like she was steadying it, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, in a register I had never once heard her use, "We're not going to tell anybody you were the last one alone with it." That's the sentence, right there. I was 19, and I'd never been in trouble in my life, and I heard my own mother say, "We're not going to tell anybody." And every bit of the 19-year-old in me heard a woman protecting her daughter. She never accused me. Not that morning, not once in 20 years. I want that stated plainly because it's the whole machine. If she'd accused me, I could have denied it. You can't deny a silence. There's nothing to get your hands on. She went to the committee that afternoon, and she cried in front of 5 people, and she told them the money was gone from her house, her responsibility, and that she'd replace every dollar of it if she had to do it $1 at a time until she was in the ground. And she wouldn't say another word about how. Not one word. She just wouldn't discuss it. Now you tell me. You're on that committee. You're sitting in the fire hall on a folding chair in March. A woman you've known 40 years tells you the money vanished out of her kitchen, and she won't say another word about it. And she has a 19-year-old daughter living in that house. You don't have to be cruel to fill that in. You just have to be a person. By Sunday, it was everywhere. Not out loud. That's not how it works here. It moved the way water moves in a field, which is to say, you never see it move, and then everything's wet. The clinic in Ashkirk let me go in April. They didn't say why, and the woman who told me couldn't look at me. And she said something about hours. And I said okay, and I went out to my car and sat there. Now the money. And this is where people have gotten me wrong every single time I've tried to tell it. My mother paid it back over 14 months, in front of everybody, in installments, at the fire hall, and by the end of it, she was a bigger name in this county than she'd been before. That's not a figure of speech either. There was a woman crying at the last payment. There was a little piece in the Ashkirk paper. A woman who lost $4,260 of other people's money and made it good on a dead husband's, she wasn't a widow yet, on a grain elevator paycheck, was the most upright thing this town had seen in a decade. And the money she paid it back with was mine. Not all of it. About 2/3 of it. $2,900 out of the credit union in June of that year, and I handed it to her at that same kitchen table, and I was glad to do it. I need you to hear that. I wasn't tricked into it, and I wasn't bullied into it. I was 19 years old, and my family was in disgrace, and my mother was crying at the kitchen table about the shame of it, and I had money and she didn't, and I gave it to her, and for about 4 days afterward I felt like the best person I'd ever been. I didn't go to the branch campus that fall. There wasn't anything to go on. My father worked Saturdays for a year at a place in Ashkirk loading trucks, and my brother Brent, who was 26 and already out of the house, gave $400, and the rest came off the table in pieces over 14 months. The smock stayed on the back of my bedroom door until I moved out, and then it went in a box, and it's been in a box ever since. I paid for my own frame. That's the sentence I couldn't say for 20 years without my throat closing. And I can say it now, so we're going to keep going. If your family ever decided something about you and then never brought it up again, never once said it out loud where you could get at it, tell me in the comments how long ago they decided. I read them. It helps to see how many of us there are. New here? Subscribe. 3 weeks ago, a milk crate came up out of my mother's crawl space, and it's the only reason I can tell you any of this at all. Here's what a name being gone actually looks like, day to day, because it isn't dramatic. It's small, and it's constant, and it never stops. Nobody hands you anything. That's it. That's the shape of it. For 20 years in this town, nobody has handed me anything to hold. Not a collection plate, not a cash drawer. Not a friend's purse while she runs to the restroom. Not the tin at a bake sale. The band boosters never asked me, and I have a kid in band. The auxiliary never asked me, and my mother ran it. When we had the shop's float in the parade, Wilma carried the money. You'd think a person could be wrong about a thing like that. You'd think it could be in my head. I thought so too, for years, so I did something about it. I keep a note on my phone. Started it in 2018. Every time somebody in Dunbarton hands me money to hold for any reason at all, I put the date in. In 8 years, there are 4 entries, and 2 of them are Wilma, and 1 is Lonnie's mother, and 1 is a man from out of county who didn't know. Other things. Brent's wife counts her change back at my kitchen table, out loud, every time. And she's a nice woman and she has no idea she does it. My son came home in 6th grade and asked me what a person has to do to get called light-fingered, and I said, "Where'd you hear that?" And he said, "Nowhere." And that was the end of the conversation, and neither one of us has ever brought it up again. More than half the people in this town were handed a story about me 20 years ago, and not one of them has ever asked me to my face whether it was true. I left town in 2007 and came back in 2010 because my dad got sick the first time. Wilma hired me that spring. She knew every bit of the story. I stood in that shop with wet hands, and I said it to her straight out, because I'd learned by then to say it before somebody else did. And Wilma looked at me over those glasses and said, "I don't hire a roomer. I hire a set of hands." Then she showed me where the towels were. That's the whole reason I've cut dogs for 16 years and never once looked for anything better. She handed me something. And my mother. All those years, my mother was kind to me. The flavor of it is the whole thing, so here's the flavor. She never shut me out. I was at every Thanksgiving. She sent birthday cards with a 20 in them. She held Tanner at the hospital when he was 2 hours old and cried. And once or twice a year, when something got close to the surface, a name came up, or somebody said fire hall in the wrong tone, or I went quiet at a table she'd find me later, in a hallway, in a kitchen, in a parking lot, hand on my arm, voice down. I never once said your name. 20 years of that. And here's what I didn't understand until this spring, and I'd give a good deal to have understood it sooner. She wasn't saying she'd protected me from an accusation. She was telling me the accusation was still there, every time. She was reaching over and putting her hand on the lid and pressing down, gently, in a hallway, twice a year, for 20 years, to make sure it was still shut. And there's the other half, which took me even longer, because you don't notice a thing that isn't there. My mother hasn't said my name out loud since I was 19 years old. Not once, not to me, and not about me. I'm my daughter when she has to introduce me. I'm her when I'm across the room. I'm the kids, or you too when Lonnie's there. On the phone she starts talking the second I pick up, no name on the front of it. Birthday cards say, Love, Mom, and the front of the envelope says my married name in her handwriting, which is the only place in 20 years I've seen her write Kendra at all, and she never has to say it out loud. I didn't work that out on my own. Tanner did, when he was 11. He asked me in the truck why Grandma calls me your mom when she's talking to him, and I'm right there. And I said, that's just how she talks, honey. And I drove home and I thought about it for 4 years. Now my father, Delbert Renfro, was not a brave man. I'm going to say the good part and the true part in the same breath, because he deserves both. He was not brave. He was in that house. He knew what a Thursday night count looked like, and he knew what my mother's face did on Friday morning. And he sat in that kitchen for 14 months while this town made his wife a saint on his daughter's money, and he never said one word. Here's what he did instead. Every time I left that house, from 2006 until the March he died, my father walked me out, every single time. Out to the car, in whatever weather. And at the car, he'd put his hand on my arm, and there'd be a folded 20 in it, and he'd say, get yourself something, and he'd go back inside before I could say anything at all. 7 years of that after I moved back, twice a month, near enough, sometimes more. Sometimes at Christmas it'd be 2. I never counted it, not once while he was alive. Because he was my dad, and it was $20, and it was just a thing he did. I sat down and started to count it a month ago, after all of this, at my own kitchen table, with a pencil. I got as far as 2014, and I put the pencil down, and I have not picked it back up, and I'm not going to. He was paying me back, $20 at a time, at a car door, in the dark, for 11 years all told. And he never said the word, and he never said her name, and he never said mine either. He wasn't brave. He was the only person in that house who ever gave me anything back. Okay, now April. My mother's 75, and last winter she went down on the ice in the driveway and got up fine. But Brent got a look at what the driveway was going to be like the next winter and the winter after. And in March, she agreed to move into a 2-bedroom at Kesterson Court, which is the senior place on the north end past the school, which meant emptying the house on Beach Street. 51 years of a house. We did it on a Saturday, all of us. Brent and his wife, me and Lonnie and Tanner, 2 cousins, and my mother in a lawn chair in the driveway in her good coat, directing traffic with a mug of coffee she never drank from. I want to say the honest thing about that morning. It was good. That's the part that still gets me. We laughed. Brent found his old wrestling singlet in the hall closet and made Tanner hold it up against himself, and my mother laughed so hard she had to set the mug on the ground, and for about 2 hours there in the driveway we were a family that had never had anything happen to it. Brent hired a boy with a truck for the heavy stuff. Cody Jarrell, 20 years old, works for his uncle, Says yes ma'am to everybody, including Dozer when he comes in the shop with his grandmother's dog. $18 an hour and worth 30. Around 2 in the afternoon, Cody went under the house. The crawl space at Beach Street you get into through a hatch in the back of the pantry, and it's not really a crawl space. It's a half cellar with a dirt floor, and there was a light down there on a string. He handed up storm windows. He handed up a box of quart jars. He handed up a bassinet that was mine, and then Brent's kids, and had mouse damage all through it. Then he came up the steps with a milk crate on his shoulder, and he set it on the kitchen floor and said, "Ma'am, whose is this?" And in the crate, folded over on top of everything else with its shaft bent double, was the boot. Black rubber gone chalky, the stripe worn off the toe, a hand-painted number up the side, older than me. I know exactly how long I looked at it because I've had 3 weeks to think about it, and the answer is not long at all, maybe a second and a half. And in that second and a half, I was not thinking anything as clear as a thought. I was 19 and standing in a kitchen, and my mother came through that back door. She was in the driveway. She was in the lawn chair in her coat. That's a good 25 feet and 2 steps and a storm door. And I want to tell you plainly that I do not know how she got there. She came through that door and she said, "That's junk. Put it on the truck." And she said it fast and flat, and it was the only sentence she said all day that didn't have any of her in it. Cody said yes ma'am and picked the crate back up. And I heard my own voice say, "I'll take that one." Just like that. No plan. I'll put that down plainly, because people have assumed otherwise since. I had no plan. I hadn't had a plan about my mother in 20 years. I said, "I'll take that one the way you'd say it about a lamp." My mother looked at me. "And this is the thing I'll carry." She didn't look frightened, and she didn't look guilty. She looked at me the way you look at a dog that's gotten between you and the gate. Then she said, "Well, it's nothing," and went back out to her chair. Cody carried the crate to my truck and set it in the bed and said, "You want this up front, ma'am?" And I said no. The back's fine, and we finished the house. That boot sat in the bed of my truck for 9 days. I know how that sounds. I'd have judged me too, at 25. But you have to understand what 20 years of this does to the inside of a person's head. I've been wrong about my mother in my own favor before. Every year or two, some little thing would happen, and a voice would start up in me saying there, "See, that's it. That's the proof." And I'd go over it and over it for a week. And at the end of it, there'd be nothing there. Just me wanting it. Wanting it is the disease. If you've been called something long enough, you get hungry to be proven not it. And that hunger will make you see things. I know women in this county who let that hunger eat their whole lives. I wasn't going to be one. So the boot sat under a tarp in the truck bed through 9 days of April rain, and I drove it to work and home again, and to the school and to the grocery, and I did not open it. On the 5th day, my mother called me. She hadn't called me for no reason since Christmas. She called about a casserole dish, hers, that she thought might be at my house, and she was pleasant for 11 minutes about a dish I've never had, and she asked after Tanner's grades, and she never once said the word crate, or the word box, or the word Saturday. I put the phone down, and I stood in my own kitchen, and I thought, well, she's not calling me about a dish. And on the 7th day, I was short with a customer. $9 nail trim, a woman I've cut for years, and her little girl was there. And the woman asked me a perfectly reasonable question twice, and I answered her the second time in a voice you could have hung meat on. I heard myself do it. That's the part. I heard myself, and I went ahead and finished the sentence anyway. I called her that night and apologized, and she was nicer about it than I'd have been. I've thought about that woman more than I've thought about half of what comes next. A thing like that boot doesn't make a person brave. It just makes you worse at the parts of your life that never did anything to you. Lonnie knew it was out there by day 2. He never said one word about it. On the 9th night, he came in his sock feet and sat down across from me and said, "You going to look at that? Or am I going to have to buy a new truck to get it out of the driveway?" And I said, "If it's nothing, I don't think I can take it being nothing again." And my husband said the smartest thing anybody's said to me in my adult life. He said, Then it can be nothing tomorrow instead of tonight. It'll keep. But you're already sitting up with it. We went out with a flashlight at 10 o'clock at night in the rain, both of us in the truck bed under the tarp like a couple of kids. It was empty. I want to say that first. There was no money down in it, and there was nothing in it at all. It was as empty as it was the morning she called me into that kitchen. But up the shaft, above the worn place, there was a strip of masking tape gone the color of weak tea, and on the tape in ballpoint pen, in my mother's handwriting, was Dutcher Family, and under that March 6th. My mother labels everything. There's tape on every casserole dish and every extension cord and every box of Christmas lights in that house. It's not sinister. It's just her. She'd taped the boot the way she taped a roaster she was carrying somewhere, so it would come home to the right place. And there it was, 20 years later, in her crawl space, under a bassinet. Lonnie held the flashlight. Neither one of us said anything for a while. Then he said, "Kendra, that's the boot off the light." He grew up here, too. He knew it on sight, in the rain, at 10 o'clock at night, from 4 feet away. That's when I understood what I actually had. It isn't proof of whose hand went down in it. A boot doesn't know that. What I had was a fact with no room in it. My mother told a committee the money left her house, and the department's boot never left her house at all. Now I want to walk you up the rest of it, because the boot by itself would have sat in my garage until I died. The first thing I did was drive out to Kesterson Manor, which is the nursing home in Ashkirk and not the same place as Kesterson Court, and it's confused people in this county for 40 years, and I asked at the desk for Orville Spielman. Orville's 88. He was the treasurer of the Dunbarton Volunteer Fire Department for 31 years, and he ran the pancake breakfast until his knees went. He keeps a fly swatter hooked over the arm of his chair, and there has not been a fly inside that building in years, and I would not take that swatter off him for anything in this world. I didn't bring the boot. I want to be clear that I didn't bring the boot, and I didn't tell him what I was after, because a man that age will agree with whatever's put in front of him if he likes you, and I've watched that happen in that same building. I asked him about the pancake breakfasts. He talked for 20 minutes about batter. Then I asked him whatever happened to the old boot, because I said I'd been thinking about my dad and the front table. And Orville Spielman said, "Oh, that one never came back." Just like that. No weight on it at all. And then he got sore, and the thing he got sore about wasn't the money. He said they'd had to put another boot out on the light, and it never did have the number on it. And his dad painted that number in 1954 with a brush out of a coffee can. And there's not a man alive now who could put it back the way it was. He said, whoever it was that helped themselves, they kept the boot too, and I've never once got my mind around that. Taking the money I can nearly understand. Taking the boot is greedy. Then he said something else, and I've thought about it every day since. He said, "Your mother asked me for one more day, you know. Thursday night she called me at home and asked could she bring it Saturday instead of Friday. And I said no, hun, Friday, because the Dutchers were in a motel. I said, Orville, she never told me that. And he said, well, there wasn't any harm in the asking. That's a man who's kept a fact in his pocket for 20 years without ever once knowing it was a fact. He wasn't testifying. He was just an old man talking about batter and a brush out of a coffee can, and he handed me the shape of that Thursday night and never knew he did it. The second person was Jenna Dutcher. Jenna's 27 now, and she's a home health aide, and she drives the whole county, and she keeps her sunglasses pushed up in her hair in February. Her mother's dog comes to me. I've known her to see her for years the way you know everybody here. I asked her to coffee, and I told her the whole thing, start to finish. And I told her I wasn't asking her for anything, and I meant it. I told her because it was her family's money, and it seemed to me she was owed the story before anybody else got it. She listened all the way through without saying a word. Then she said, I was 7. She said, all I remember is somebody's coat and the smell. And she said, but I'll tell you what I grew up hearing, because I heard it at my own table my whole life. She said, we always heard that a girl took it, and a good woman made it right. A girl took it. That was the shape of it in the house it was taken from. Then she said, what was the girl's name? And I said, "Nobody ever said." And Jenna Dutcher put her cup down and looked at me for a good while and said, "That's a hell of a way to run a rumor." Then I went to my brother. Brent's 46, and he does lawns and snow, and he sits on the fire department board, which he'll tell you he does for the town, and which is also the single best table in Dunbarton to sit at if you'd like people to think well of you. I love my brother. He's not a bad man. He is a man who found out early that things go easier if you don't look directly at them. I laid it out at his kitchen table. The boot, the tape, the crawl space, Orville, the Friday, the Saturday she asked for. He got up while I was still talking and started wiping a counter that was already clean. That's what my brother does. The second a thing turns, he finds work for his hands, and he keeps his back to you the whole time he's doing it. With his back to me, he said, "Kendra, that boot's been down there 20 years. Anybody could have put it there." And I said, "Who's anybody? Name one." And he said, "That's not the point." And I said, "It's exactly the point. That's the only point there's ever been." And then my brother said the thing that ended it. He said, "Look, she's 75. What is it you want here? You want to take her out of the church? You want her name on this?" And when I didn't answer fast enough, he said, "Because it'd kill her, and you've got a life, and it's been 20 years. And I don't see what you get out of it." There it was. What do you get? I sat in his driveway afterward, and I let myself understand that my brother has known something in his back pocket for a very long time. Not known, suspected, and declined to develop it. Those are different, and both of them cost me 20 years, and only one of them's a sin. By Tuesday, my mother had gotten out in front of me, and I have to give her this. She is the best I have ever seen at it. She didn't call me. She called Brent. Then she called our cousin Roxy, who's the auxiliary president now, and writes on the back of her own hand instead of paper. Then, and this is the one that told me she was frightened, she called Wilma Ackerman at the shop. The story going around inside of a week was this. Kendra's been going through her mother's house. Kendra's been in the crawl space. Kendra took something out of the house on moving day and won't give it back. And under it, warm and sad and worried, the real one. I think this move has stirred something up in her, and you know she's never been settled. Never been settled. 20 years of not being handed things, delivered back to me as a diagnosis. Wilma hung up on her. I found that out later and not from Wilma. And my mother worked the Methodist side too, which is where she's strongest. By the second Sunday, there were 2 women in this town I've known my whole life who looked at a spot about 4 inches to the left of my face in the grocery parking lot. That lands differently at 39 than it did at 19, and the difference is the point. At 19, it took my legs out. At 39, standing in a parking lot with a gallon of milk, watching a woman I've known since Sunday school choose the middle distance what I felt was recognition. That's all. Oh, there you are. I know you. You've been doing this to me since I was 19 years old, and this is the first time I've been able to watch you do it. That's the difference 20 years makes. The knife's the same. You just know what it is. Now I want to tell you about the week I spent deciding, because that week is the part of this I'm actually proud of, and it isn't the boot. Here's everything I could have done. And every one of these was suggested to me by somebody who loves me. I could have taken it to the sheriff. I called and asked, in the abstract, without names. 20 years is a long way outside any of it. Nothing's happening there, and I knew it before I dialed. I could have taken it to the paper in Ashkirk. Lonnie's brother said that. And it would have run, too, and it would have been a piece about an old woman and a crawl space, and my mother would have been a victim by Thursday. You can't hand a small town a story like that and keep hold of what it meant. I could have called Brent's board and made it a fire department matter. That was the one that tempted me. That's the room where it started. That's the room that got robbed, and there's a certain justice in it. And I could have put the tape and the crawl space and Orville Spielman into a message and sent it to 19 relatives at 8 o'clock at night. I wrote it on a Wednesday in my truck outside the school waiting on Tanner. And it was 4 paragraphs long, and it was the best writing I've ever done in my life. I didn't send it, and not because I'm a better person than that. I got to the end of it and asked the only useful question there is, and then what? 19 people read it on their phones. Half of them believe it. Half of them decide I'm cruel. My mother cries to somebody, and the whole thing turns into an argument about me. That's what a message does. It puts the question up for a vote, and the people voting are the ones who got it wrong the first time, on a screen, at 8 o'clock at night. What I wanted wasn't a verdict. It took me the whole week to get it into words. So here it is in the words it finally came in. I wanted my name said out loud, in the room where it got taken, by the person who took it. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not her punished, not her out of the church, not the county's opinion. I wanted the one specific thing that had been withheld from me for 20 years, which was somebody saying, Kendra, where the people who'd decided about me could hear it. And there was exactly one room in the world where all of those people were going to be at the same time, and my mother had already scheduled it and mailed the cards. Now let me deal with the thing that's probably sitting in your chest right now, because it sat in mine. Her birthday, her 75th birthday. The woman is 75 years old and the whole auxiliary is throwing her a dinner at the fire hall, and I walked into it with the boot. I've turned that over more times than you'd believe, and here's where I came out. She built that room, not me. Every person who was going to be standing in it was standing in it because Yvonne Renfro invited them, and every one of them had gotten the story about me from her, in her house, at her table, in her silence. I didn't gather one soul. I didn't tell a living person outside my kitchen what I was going to do. I set no bait, and I asked nobody to be there, and I made nothing happen. She made the room. She's been making that room for 50 years. And the accusation was public. It went out into a whole county without ever being spoken. You can't answer a thing like that in a hallway. You can't answer it in a phone call with one person who's going to hang up and characterize it. A thing that was said everywhere at once has to be answered where everybody is. The other half of it is uglier, and I'll say it anyway. She's 75. The next room with all of those people in it is her funeral, and I wasn't going to do it there, where she couldn't answer me back. Whatever else this was going to be, it was going to be a thing where she got to talk. So on the second Saturday of April, I put on a good shirt, and I put the boot down in an empty feed sack from the co-op, and I drove to the fire hall with my husband and my son, the way I had every year, the way I have gone to every single thing that family has ever held, for 20 years, invited and unasked for, because I never once stopped showing up, and that is either the best or the stupidest thing about me. The community room at the Dunbarton Fire Hall has a drop ceiling and 8 folding tables and a photograph of a 1968 pumper on the wall. That's the room. That is the exact room where the pancake breakfast money got counted, on the front table, out of that box, for 40 years. They had it decorated. Roxy had done a banner. There was a cake from the grocery, and a coffee urn, and a card table by the door piled with gifts, and about 40 people, and my mother in a chair at the front in a blue dress with her hair set, receiving. That's the only word. She was receiving. I sat at the back with Lonnie and Tanner, and I ate a plate of ham and scalloped potatoes, and I couldn't tell you what any of it tasted like. Jenna Dutcher was there with her mother, 4 tables up. Orville wasn't. Brent was at the front with his wife. Dalton Wingert, who's chief now, said a few words. Then Roxy stood up and read a thing she'd written, and it was sweet, and it was about the phone tree, and the funeral dinners, and 40 years of showing up, and everybody laughed at the right places. And then Roxy said the part she'd been building to, and I promise you I didn't know it was coming, and I'd have given a good deal for it not to, she said. And I don't think there's a soul in this room who's forgotten the year we lost the Dutcher money, and how this woman paid back every dollar of it out of her own pocket without ever once telling us how she managed it. The room went warm the way rooms do. There was a sound people make, and 2 tables up, an old man I've known my whole life shook his head slowly with his mouth pulled down, the way you do at a thing that's just too good, and my mother sat there in her blue dress and let it come to her, and she did the thing with her chin that she does. They brought the cake and they sang, and she blew out the candles in 2 goes, and everybody clapped, and Roxy started cutting. and I stood up and walked to the front with a paper grocery sack. I've had a lot of time to think about what I felt walking up there, and the truthful answer is nothing much. My ears were loud. That's all I've got. There wasn't any of the thing you'd expect. What my hands did, I can tell you, because my hands have been doing it for 16 years. When a dog on my table is scared, you go slow and you go low, and you keep both hands where the animal can see them the whole way in, and you don't talk fast and you don't reach over the top of its head. That's what I did. I walked up on my own mother's 75th birthday the exact way I'd walk up on a dog that's been hit before, and I didn't decide to. 16 years of a thing gets into your arms. I set the sack on the table beside the cake, and I took the boot out and I stood it up on the tablecloth, and I folded the sack. I said one sentence. I'd decided on the one sentence in the truck 4 days before, and I'd said it out loud about 200 times, and here it is. This was in your crawl space, Mom. That's all I said. And then I stood there and I did not say another word. And this is the part I'd tell anybody who's ever going to do a thing like this. Everything after that came out of her. The room hadn't caught up yet. Most of them were still looking at the cake. But there were 30 people in that room who had personally put $1 down in that boot at that light, some of them holding a child up to do it. And I watched it go through them like a draft under a door. And my mother looked at the boot, and her face came apart in a way I've never seen on her, not at her own husband's funeral, and she said it. I was going to put it back. She said it out loud, in her own voice, at a normal volume, in a room with 40 people in it, and she said it fast, the way you say a thing you've had loaded for 20 years and always assumed you'd get to use in private. Nobody made a sound. I've heard rooms go quiet before. This wasn't that. This was 40 people, all doing arithmetic at the same time and arriving at the same place about 4 seconds apart, and you could hear the 4 seconds. Then Roxy Stemple said, "Oh, Yvonne," very quietly, and that's all anybody said for what felt like a long time. And then my mother started, and I'm going to give you all 3 of them in order because they came in order, and I think she's had them in that order her whole life. First was tears, and they were real. I'm not going to tell you they weren't, she said. You don't know what it was like, she said. You have no idea what that year was. Nobody in here knows. And that's true, and it's the reason I've never once said she doesn't feel things. Second was Brent. She turned, and she said his name, and she said, "Tell them." And when he didn't say anything, she went to the room instead and said, "She's been in my house. She took this out of my house. She's been going through my things since the day I said I was moving." She said she took this out of my house, in front of everybody, to a room that had just heard where the boot was, and I still didn't say anything, because there wasn't any need. And third, when the second one didn't take, she pulled herself up in the chair and got her chin back, and she said the last one. She said, "I am your mother, and this is my birthday, and there is not one person in this room who needs this." And that's when I answered her. Once, I said, "Mom, they've all needed it for 20 years. They just didn't know they were owed it." And she looked at me, and here it came, the last thing in the bag, and she reached across and put her hand out toward my arm without touching it, and she said it in front of every one of them in the same voice she's used in every hallway of my life. "I never once said your name." And I said, "That's right. You didn't." I said, "You also never used it. 20 years, Mom. You haven't said Kendra out loud since I was 19 years old." And I heard my own voice do something I hadn't planned, which was go quiet instead of loud. I said, "Say it now." And 40 people in a fire hall watched my mother open her mouth. She couldn't do it. I have thought about that for 3 weeks, and I do not know to this day whether it was that she wouldn't or that after 20 years of not, the thing had gotten too heavy to lift in public. I don't think it matters much. It looked exactly the same from where I was standing, and it looked exactly the same to everybody else. She said, "Don't do this." And into that, from 4 tables up, a woman's voice said, "Kendra." It was Jenna Dutcher, standing up beside her mother with her sunglasses pushed up in her hair in April, and she said it again, louder, to the room, not to me. She said, "Her name's Kendra." "It was my family's money," she said. "And I'm the one who's supposed to be sore about it, and I'm not sore at her." 27 years old. She was 7 when it happened, and she stood up in a room full of her elders and said my name out loud. That's when I went. I'd like to tell you there was a line, but there wasn't. I picked the paper sack up off the table because I'd been raised not to leave trash on a table, which I'm aware is a ridiculous thing to be thinking about. And I looked at the boot, and I left it there. It wasn't mine. It never was. I said, "That goes back to the department," and I walked out the side door past the gift table, and Lonnie and Tanner came after me, and my son got the door. The parking lot was still light out. It was 6:40 in the evening in April in Ohio, and it was still light out, and I remember being surprised by that, like a thing that big should have taken until dark. Here's what came after, and it moved about as fast as paper moves in a county this size, which is not fast. The fire department board took the boot. They've got it. Dalton Wingert called me on the Tuesday and asked me 2 questions and wrote down the answers, and then he asked a third one, which was whether I wanted anything from them, and I said no. What the board did in the end was strike 4 lines about the Dutcher Drive out of the department's 50th anniversary book, and somebody went through the 11 copies still in the closet by hand with a pen. I've seen one. It's ugly, and it's crossed out in ballpoint by a man who had to press hard, and I would not trade it for a headstone. Roxy Stemple came to the shop. She stood in the doorway with her keys in her hand, and she said, "I read that out at her party. I said the words, out at her party." And she cried, and I got her a chair, and Dozer got out of the second chair for her, which he has done for no one before or since. My mother's version got out inside of a week, and it's a good one. She's got it that she took the money to cover something of my father's and put it back with her own hands, and that the boot being in the crawl space is nothing but a woman who never throws anything away, which, I'll grant you, is a true thing about her. About a third of this county has decided that's what happened. That third has mostly decided the same thing they decided 20 years ago, which is that Yvonne Renfro carried something heavy for a family that wasn't grateful. She hasn't spoken to me. It's been 3 weeks. I don't expect that to change, and I've stopped building rooms in my head where it does. Brent came by on a Sunday. He stood in the middle of my kitchen with nothing anywhere near him to wipe, and he said, "I should have asked more questions in 06. And I said, "You didn't ask any." And he said, "No, I didn't." And that was the whole conversation, and he left, and we're not fixed, and I don't know that we will be. He still sits on that board. He still has Sunday dinner with her. I don't hold it against him the way I'd have expected to. I've just stopped thinking of him as somebody I'd call if something happened. The county did what a county does, which is nothing you can point to. Nobody apologized. There's no mechanism for a town to apologize. That's not a thing that exists. But here's what happened instead, and I'd rather have it. 11 days after the party, the auxiliary had a pancake breakfast, and Roxy called and asked if I'd take the front table. The front table is the money. That's what the front table is. I sat there for 3 hours on a Saturday morning making change out of the green plastic tackle box the auxiliary keeps the float in now, and old men I've known my whole life handed me their $3, and I handed them back their 2 singles. And every one of them put it right into my hand. 4 entries in 8 years on that note on my phone. I sat there, and I took money out of 200 and some hands in one morning, and along about the 9th or 10th one, I had to go stand in the kitchen for a minute, and I went and got the smock out of the box. Teal, snap collar, Kendra, in white thread over the pocket, 20 years in a box, and it's got a fold line across the chest that will never come out, and it smells like a basement, and it fit, which honestly annoyed me. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I went back to school, because I didn't, and I might not. I'm 39, with a kid in high school, and a job I'm good at, and a well-out back that runs cold in February. What I did was I hung it on the hook at the shop, and I've worn it every day since, and Pearl's owner asked me on the Thursday whether I'd got a new job, and I said no. I said, "I've got the same job. This is just my name." Wilma Ackerman looked up from her coffee can of pens that don't write, and didn't say a word about any of it, which from Wilma is a standing ovation. My father's 20s I'm still not going to count. Lonnie asked me if I wanted to, one night, gently, and I said no, and he said okay, and he's never brought it up again. It's the only inheritance I got, and I'd rather have it be a number I never landed on. He wasn't brave. He was standing at a car door in the dark, handing me $20, year after year, and I've decided that's what I'm keeping. I used to think a name was something you got handed once, and that if somebody took it off you, the way back was to prove something. Now I know a name is $6 of white thread on a pocket, and it isn't worth 1 cent in this world until somebody else reads it out loud. That's my story. One black rubber boot with a strip of her tape up the shaft, $4,260 that were never mine, and cost me $2,900 of my own, and a teal smock with $6 of white thread on the pocket. If there's a person in your family who's been carrying a thing nobody's ever said out loud to their face, a story everybody's agreed on, and nobody's ever put in a sentence, go and say their name to them. This week, out loud, in front of somebody else. It costs you nothing, and I'm here to tell you it's worth more than you think. Share this with the one in your family who stopped getting handed things. They'll know exactly what I mean before you finish the first minute. And tell me in the comments, has anybody ever said your name out loud when it counted? Who was it? I'd like to know their names, too. If you're new here, subscribe. That's all of it. Thank you for sitting with me on the porch tonight. I'll see you in the next one.